Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first and quite possibly the last GingerGM production devoted exclusively to the C3 Sicilian from White's perspective. My name's Sam Collins. I'm an international master. The C3 Sicilian is essentially my only opening against the Sicilian, which I guess means it's my main White opening, given that the Sicilian is the most popular defense to e4. And the story of how I came to play this opening is short and not particularly interesting. I got beaten mercilessly with the opening when Paul Motwani played it against me in a game which I'll mention just after this introduction, and when Luke McShane played it against me in a game which I won't show you because you won't be able to find on databases, and that's how I'd prefer to keep it. I've used it for a number of years against pretty good opposition, IMs and GMs, with quite a lot of success. All of the best games have been mercilessly trumpeted on this particular DVD, and you'll see those in all of the theoretical sections in the illustrative games. Probably my high water mark in terms of a score with this opening was when I spent 9 months living in Japan. I played pretty much a full chess season there of 50 games, 25 white games, of which 24 I played e4. All of them were answered with the Sicilian. All of those Sicilians were answered with c3, and out of 24 I think I scored 23 and a half. So that's a score which I'm probably unlikely to replicate, but was certainly good fun to make while it was happening. The idea of the C3 Sicilian is pretty basic. After e4, White wants to play d4, c5 stops that, and c3 re-threatens it in a way which doesn't wreck White's pawn structure by giving Black an extra center pawn for no particular reason. That's the idea, and it's a very straightforward one. One of the things which maybe people don't appreciate if they just come across this opening once in a while is the type of attacking structures to which it can lead. For instance, after 2 knight f6, which is one of Black's two main responses, White responds with e5, and this pawn tends to stay on e5 for a large part of the early middle game. The effect of that is that Black can't use the f6 square for a knight. The effect of that is that the Black kingside tends to be weakened. Black will frequently have to move a pawn on the kingside and will be able to attack him over there. Conversely, Black's other main second move, which is 2 d5, tends to be answered by pawn takes d5, queen takes d5, and now d4. And now, if Black takes on d4, either because he wants to or because after bishop e3 he's forced to, we end up in an isolated queen's pawn structure. This is something which we're going to spend a lot of time on simply because it arises in a large number of the illustrative games, a large number of the theoretical sections, and I think by the end of this you'll have a pretty good idea of how to handle those positions with White. They tend to lead to pretty natural attacking chances. So those are the two main structures which arise in the C3 Sicilian. I think that they're both pleasant for White, they're both very dynamic and put Black under a lot of pressure, and I don't really understand why more people don't play the opening. So it's an opening which leads to very dynamic, interesting attacking structures and possibilities for White, leads to a lot of danger for Black. It's something which I've happily had as my main weapon against the Sicilian, and I'll continue to do so. And I hope by the end of this presentation you'll be convinced to take it up too. So hope you enjoy the DVD. So I thought we'd open the DVD by getting the most painful experience out of the way. This is a game which I played as Black against the very dangerous Scottish Grandmaster Paul Motwani in the 2003 British Championship. And Paul really took me apart in the C3 Sicilian in a way which I suppose convinced me that I should give the opening a try with White. Paul opened with e4. I responded with the Sicilian, and then the 2c3 move order was used. Here I used my main defense at the time to the c3 Sicilian, which was based on knight f6. And we'll see what the system which I use here is a combination of e6 and d6. It's a very popular, solid setup for Black, and it's one which is quite difficult for white to simplify the game. So it's quite a popular choice. Paul used a move order with knight f3. We'll see later that I recommend just putting this pawn on d4 immediately. I don't think that anything great is gained by knight f3. I played with e6. And now Paul, who's a very dangerous attacking grandmaster, looks for an opportunity to give away his pawns at every opportunity, and found one here. And he started with d4. I took on d4, and now bishop c4. Now, this is a gambit. I can take the pawn on c3, but it's very risky to do that because black is falling very far behind in development. So especially against a grandmaster who's very adept at tactical complications, I didn't look twice at that pawn and just played my normal system with d6. C takes d4. And now bishop e7. And now we both castled. And here, as we'll see when we get into the theory of this particular variation, there are a number of different ways which white can play. And Paul chose what was probably the main line at the time, which is based on queen e2, knight c6. And now, instead of knight c3, which is going to be my recommendation, which creates a real threat against the d5 knight, Paul played his queen to e4. Now, it's an interesting move. It's got a lot of positive points. The first is that the knight on d5 is under attack. The issue is that the knight isn't properly under attack because black can generally gambit a pawn on d5. Because after bishop takes d5, e takes d5, queen takes d5, black will normally have, for instance, d takes e5, and just his lead in development tends to be enough compensation. He tends to get this pawn back quite simply. So queen e4 doesn't really create a threat against the d5 knight, in my opinion. It does have another dangerous attacking idea, though, which is that when this bishop drops back to d3, it's going to create a problem for me on h7. I'm going to have to weaken my kingside in some way. And we'll see Paul using that idea to excellent effect. But in general, I don't like this system. I've tried it with white, and I didn't score very well with it. So it's not going to be my recommendation here. I chose rook e8. And now Paul, kind of indicating what I'm saying, chose not to take on d5. I think bishop takes d5, e takes d5, queen takes d5. After d takes e5, we might just look at that so you're convinced. So in this position, after d takes e5, white's a pawn up at the moment, but his queen's under attack, so he's going to have to trade. And perhaps the most straightforward variation, if anyone's doubting, is bishop takes d8. And now white's not going to win a pawn on e5, so black is very comfortable in the endgame. So just an illustration of the fact that this doesn't create a real threat against the d5 knight, in my opinion. Now Paul knew that as well, of course, so he didn't take on d5. Instead, he just continued developing with rook e1. And now I think the best move for me here would be to leave my knight on d5 for another move. So maybe play with bishop d7. This move which I played, knight b6, in my view, gives white slightly too much. The first reason is that this b6 square is a terrible square for a black knight. We'll see this throughout the DVD, that a knight on b6 does nothing. It's a target for an a4, a5 advance. And I'm taking one of my best pieces out of the center, putting it on b6 for no real reason. Now Paul saw that his bishop is attacked, of course, so demonstrated the second main idea, or really the only main idea, of queen e4, which is that this queen and bishop battery creates a problem for me on h7. So now I'm going to have to move one of my kingside pawns and weaken myself. I chose g6. There isn't really an alternative for me here because I've moved my knight from d5. Had my knight still been on d5, I might have been able to play f5 instead, because then after e takes f6, knight takes f6, the white queen's attacked, but I also protect the h7 pawn. But this knight b6 move means that I don't have that option anymore. Paul continued developing, and I chose knight b4. So kind of an inconsistent approach really from black here. On the one hand, I move my knight away from d5. On the other hand, I'm trying to bring my other knight around to d5. In the meantime, my kingside's been weakened, and I've been wasting time, which white has spent developing. But the other thing which I'd like to draw your attention to in this position, it's something which crops up all the time in the C3 Sicilian, is this pawn on e5. Because this pawn on e5 gives white a huge advantage in kingside space. Very importantly, it means that the f6 square is unavailable for a black knight. And that is essentially black's main problem in this position, is that his kingside isn't properly defended because there isn't a knight holding things together on f6. Now he could, or I could in this game, try to move my knight back to f8 maybe to defend things, but it's more awkward. And this is something which happens time and time again. I find psychologically, actually, it's one of the main weapons in the C3 Sicilian, because people think that it's a quiet opening, and they think that they're not going to fall under a kingside attack. But you'll see here that Paul's able to rustle up a huge kingside attack against me very quickly indeed. So he preserved his key bishop b1, and I moved my knight back to d5. And now Paul played queen g4. So this is really a textbook method of attacking in this kind of structure, where you've got a pawn on e5, cutting out any knight f6 idea, and also black's weakened himself with g6. So the first idea of queen g4 is that he might be able to bring his knight to e4, which is going to be incredibly dangerous for me, because then his knight is going to be the one which threatens to come to f6. He might be able to play bishop to g5 to exchange a key defender of my dark squares. And also he's got the standard plan in these positions of just h4, h5 to take on g6, and then a bishop takes g6 sacrifice is going to be just around the corner. So this position, from a practical point of view, I think is incredibly difficult for black. Now I took on c3. Paul recaptured. And now I play queen c7. So I'm trying to somehow create counterplay based on this slightly weak pawn on c3. And it's possible to defend this pawn for white, but it's slightly awkward. So for instance, with bishop d2, I'd have knight c4, which is going to attack that piece. But Paul, as I mentioned before, isn't somebody who really counts the pawns, and decided to just give up that c3 pawn to gain time for a kingside attack. And this position, I suppose, as the top GMs say, for a human, this position is practically impossible to defend. Computer analysis has shown that it's maybe okay for black to take this pawn, but realistically, I think that there's very little chance of survival. This was one of my first games which got annotated and published in a database, which, as you might appreciate, I wasn't delighted about. But Luke Wynant's gave some analysis to show that after queen takes c3, h5, queen takes a1, with bishop h6, white's attack, which to my mind looks absolutely crushing, is actually just enough for a draw. After bishop f8, h takes g6, h takes g6. I think Luke also gives some detailed analysis about bishop takes h6, but we don't really need to concern ourselves with that. And now bishop takes g6. Essentially, white gives up an awful lot of material, and is probably going to be forced to give perpetual check. That's Luke's verdict. That's something which I've checked with the computer since, and it seems to be the correct verdict. But from a practical point of view, I think if you offered anyone this position or anything close to it with black, they wouldn't take you on. And that was very much the thinking which informed my choice in the game, because I thought that it was too dangerous to take this c3 pawn. But unfortunately, for me, that meant that Paul had just gotten an extra tempo for his attack for free. So after h4, I chose not to take this pawn, but instead to play knight d7. But now this attack is just too strong after h5, and I've got no compensation. At least in that line, I would have had a rook. But after h5, taking on g6 followed by bishop takes g6 is just around the corner. I tried to stop this threat by f5. Now again, I'm not unhappy with him taking en passant, because then I can take with the knight and hit this queen and hit the h5 pawn. So another example of why it was a bad idea to move the knight away from the center in the first place. But Paul just played queen g3, and I played king g7. So just trying to hold this kingside together. But Paul demonstrates very nicely that the defense doesn't hold at all. So he took on g6, and now something which I hadn't seen at all, but unfortunately Paul had. Bishop takes f5. So this move is just completely crushing. And part of the problem, as we'll see, is that the black rook on e8 is undefended. And that's because I didn't get around to developing my my c8 bishop. But again, I think even though this game, as we'll see, is completely crushing for white, I don't think that black did anything obviously wrong. But he's just falling prey to this enormous attack right now. So I took the bishop. Paul took on d6. Bishop takes d6, and now another example of Paul's tactical talent. Bishop h6 check. So I can't remember how many of these bishop sacrifices I'd seen, but my guess is 0. In any event, this position is now completely hopeless, and I probably should have resigned after bishop h6 check. But instead I decided to enjoy being 2 pieces up for a moment. Queen h4 check, king g7. Rook takes e8, knight f8. And now, very thematic, rook ae1. So bringing its last piece into the game with absolutely devastating effect. There's nothing I can do against rook e7 check, which is going to win either a queen or a king. It doesn't particularly matter. And I resigned at this point. So this game was something of an eye-opener to me, because I'd been playing the Sicilian for a long time, had faced the C3 Sicilian a fair bit, and thought that it was a quiet opening. I was actually quite surprised when Paul chose it against me. But unfortunately, when I have to resign after 26 moves, after a blistering kingside attack, I learned that this system can actually be used by the most aggressive players.